the quality of your life is shaped fundamentally by certain opinions that you hold, predominantly your value judgments. The things that you value and the things that you despise are going to shape your character and therefore the quality of your life.
Are you Marcus Aurelius' number one fan, do you think? Or do you think that you're the most educated on him, or one of the most educated on him that's alive at the moment?
I mean, it doesn't seem like that much of a brag because I've spent so much time having to read his stuff. I must be one of the people in the world that knows the most about Marcus Aurelius now, just because I've spent so much time writing stuff about him. And I kind of thought I learned a lot about him. And then obviously when you write other stuff, like you write from a different perspective, the graphic novel, I suddenly had to think, what did this look like? And what did that look like? And so it made me explore his life from a bit of a different perspective. I had to visualize it more. And I thought, well, now I know everything I need to know about him. But then when I did the more academic biography, that was to a more rigorous standard in a way. And I thought, no, I'm now doing research that's even deeper than I did before. So apparently there's always more to learn.
So but, Marcus Aurelius,
there can't be that much left.
Emperor of Rome, but followed a Greek-born philosophy. Why?
Yeah. Well, let's get into some obscure stuff then. I can't be 100% sure about this. I'm going to start speculating, Chris, right? I reckon it was to do with his mum, partly. That's one reason. So his father passed away when Marcus was, we think, about 3 or 4 years old. And so he was brought up to a large extent, although not exclusively, by his mother. Now, his mother was a very wealthy and powerful woman. She was a construction magnate, believe it or not. And we know that because we have hundreds of bricks with her name stamped on them. She owned a brick and tile factory and clay fields that were used in construction. So she was a very wealthy and powerful woman, not like we might have kind of assumed, in Roman times. And she seems to have had an intellectual circle that surrounded her, like a salon of intellectuals at their house. And so she was a very well-educated woman. Here's a bit of trivia for you. Marcus Cornelius Fronto, who is Marcus's Latin rhetoric tutor and was considered the greatest Roman orator since Cicero, which is, quite an accolade. We have a letter from him where he says to Marcus, he's writing to Marcus's mother in Greek, and he says, Marcus, kind of pathetically, could you check my grammar and like vocabulary and stuff to make sure that it's okay before your mum reads it? So Fronto, one of the greatest intellectuals of the era, is kind of intimidated by Marcus's mother.
That's cool.
It is cool. And so because she was really into Greek culture and literature, I think she brought up her son to be into Greek philosophy, and that kind of led to Stoicism. Also, this is a real deep dive. Roman matriarchs are believed to have been the ones that were mainly responsible for choosing the tutors that were employed. And Marcus had an unusual number of Stoic philosophy tutors. So he got into Stoicism himself. But we also have to assume that his family were kind of steering him in that direction, and it was probably his mum that picked those Stoic tutors for him.
What was the culture of Rome like? Were there Roman philosophers as well? Obviously, yeah. Apart from Marcus, what was the difference between them and the Stoics?
I mean, the culture was that Marcus was living through a cultural movement called the Second Sophistic. So the sophists, people may have heard of as these kind of quasi-philosophers or intellectuals that Socrates was kind of jousting with intellectually. He was a critic of the sophists. But there was a resurgence of popularity in the Roman Empire of the sophists. So these were Greek orators and speechwriters and generally intellectuals who came over, and they were viewed as exotic, and they became very trendy for centuries in the Roman Empire. And Marcus kind of grew up in the middle of that. So Hadrian, who is a huge figure in Marcus's life, Hadrian became Marcus's adoptive grandfather. And Marcus was brought into Hadrian's villa and raised in his household for around about 6 months towards the end of Hadrian's life. Hadrian kind of wanted to be a sophist. Like he spent a lot of time in Athens. He did a lot of construction in Athens. Like, he saw himself as an intellectual and surrounded himself with these sophists. And Marcus grew up in this kind of, I guess we would say, sort of pretentious intellectual culture. And his mum was kind of connected with that. The most influential Greek orator, the most influential intellectual in a sense of the period, was a guy called Herodes Atticus, who's famous now in Greece because the Foo Fighters performed a concert at a building called the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. It's a famous building on the side of the Acropolis, which still exists.
I've been to it.
Yeah, you've been there. And like, Sting and like Brian Eno, all these kind of musicians perform there now. And Herodes Atticus was like a billionaire and a celebrity orator, like a rock star of the period. But he was also a really horrible man with a really bad temper. He was raised for a time in the same household as Marcus Aurelius' mother. Like, we know that's a little kind of fragment of a clue. So she knew the leading sophist of the era. So how's that? This guy that we think of as a Stoic, or typically critics of these kind of pretentious intellectuals, his mum grew up in the same household, is the most influential and famous sophist of them all. And he became a family friend, sort of, a kind of frenemy in a way, for the rest of Marcus's life. At one point, he lunged at Marcus like he was going to throttle him or something, and he was nearly executed by the Praetorian prefect. But Marcus stood up and told his guards to stand down.
I suppose if you are, if the person that is at the absolute tip of the spear of the cool movement of the time also happens to be a bit of a dick, that's a pretty good excuse to not want your son to grow up like that.
That's a good description. I mean, what have we got against Herodes? He did that horrible thing. The Athenians hated him. They were always trying to sue him in court. He kind of he was tried because he was accused of kicking his pregnant wife to death, although he was acquitted of that. But there's a kind of stigma that hung over him, like he kind of managed to dodge a bullet there. So the irony is that we know, here's another cool bit of trivia. Like, we know that Herodes Atticus had read Epictetus, and he kind of liked to quote him sometimes. Like, the sophists would often quote philosophers, but they kind of appropriated it because it sounded cool. Like, they didn't really live like philosophers. Like, it was more about, they literally, like social media today, they would give speeches where they tried to win the biggest round of applause, like getting the most likes or something like that. They were celebrities. So we know Herodes Atticus criticized the Stoics because he said they espouse insensibility. He goes, they root out the most kind of vibrant emotions, and you don't want to end up like one of these guys, like a robot or whatever. And the Stoics said that's not at all what we're about. So this guy that's saying the Stoics are too unemotional, I think Marcus looked at him and said, dude, I don't want to be like you, though. Like, you've got an appallingly bad temper. And like, I think one of the things that really shaped Marcus was seeing these guys side by side and thinking, this dude that's saying embrace your passions and all that is actually a kind of horrible, violent person. And these other guys that are saying, no, you have to learn to understand and to master your passions. Marcus loved and really admired those dudes, and just at a personal level, much more than, he ever warmed to Herodes Atticus.
What was the story of how Meditations was actually written? It was even a different name when it was first written, right?
Yeah, it was called, well, the earliest manuscript was headed to himself. So it may be that that's the title that it was originally given, which is kind of interesting because ancient philosophers would sometimes say that to learn philosophy is to learn to discourse, to talk with yourself, which is from a cognitive therapy point of view. I'm a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. This idea that it's about learning how to talk to yourself rationally is a really cool concept. And in the Meditations, Marcus kind of has this recurring phrase where he says, every morning, say to yourself. So the book consists of lots of things that he's telling himself to say to himself. So it's a very appropriate heading for it. How it was written, we believe that it was written pretty much coinciding with the First Marcomannic War. And it happens to be just after Marcus's main philosophy tutor, Junius Rusticus, dies. So I'm very tempted to visualize. Again, when you do the graphic novel, you're trying to visualize these things. You think, look, this guy's just died. That is his main tutor. He's just left Rome pretty much for the first time to go to Austria in this climate that he finds very harsh. with the military. It's the first time he's really been like stationed himself with the military like this, like a real fish out of water suddenly. And he does not have. He may have had some philosophers with him, but he did not really have this kind of circle of philosophers that he would have had at Rome. And we know Marcus liked to write letters, so I imagine that he was probably writing letters to some of the philosophers that he was friends with. I wish we still had those. We have letters to his rhetoric tutor where they kind of gossip about philosophy a bit and stuff. But I imagine that when Rusticus died, Marcus was left thinking, who am I going to talk to about philosophy now? And if he'd been writing to him, it would have been very natural for him to think, maybe I need to carry on writing about philosophy, but instead of addressing letters to Rusticus, who's now passed away, I should write to myself. And I would like to imagine that some of the things that Marcus is saying in the Meditations must be things that he heard in lectures, or that he'd read in books, or that he'd discussed, maybe written about in letters to Rusticus and the various other Stoic tutors that he had.
How much do you think is original thought then? And how much do you think is repurposed from people that or places that we perhaps don't have access to anymore?
That's a really good question. And the short answer is we'll die not knowing, Chris. Probably. We'll never be able to figure that out. I'll tell you some really cool trivia about it. The person that Marcus Aurelius quotes most often is Epictetus. Like, he clearly loves Epictetus. And he says at the beginning that one of the biggest moments in his life was when Junius Rusticus gave him a copy from his personal library of the Discourses of Epictetus. Now, the Discourses of Epictetus are quite long. They're like 4 volumes. But one ancient source says there were originally 8 volumes. So half of them have gone missing, right? They were misplaced sometime over the centuries, annoyingly. Now, Marcus quotes stuff that's in the Discourses, but he also quotes stuff from Epictetus that we've never heard before. So what's really cool is to imagine that Marcus Aurelius had read the 4 missing volumes of Epictetus. He knows even more about this dude than we do. And so, like, because they don't use quotation marks and they don't cite things, certainly Marcus writing informally doesn't do anything like that. He occasionally will say, as Plato said, or as Epictetus said. So there's a clue. But some of the things he said look like they're quotes. And maybe some of the stuff that we attribute to Marcus Aurelius is actually stuff that Epictetus said that he's just copying down into his notes, but it doesn't have quotation marks around it, for all we know.
Are you familiar with Churchillian drift? Do you know what that is?
No, I've not heard that expression before.
You need it. You need it in your life. So you'll have heard a lot of people attribute quotes to. I think it was Churchill that said this thing. It's the phenomenon whereby quotes that are kind of difficult to attribute end up moving slowly over time toward being Churchill. You could also have like an Einsteinian drift as well, I think, like Einstein and Churchill. I don't know who said this quote, so I'd better say Churchill said it because it probably was. And what you have here is like an Aureliusian drift, in that because so much less of his work has been lost than other people around that time, or at least because so much of it has been preserved, that means if he's been condensing down other people's work, maybe he is taking license for other people's stuff.
I mean, it could be that loads of the Meditations is just quotes from other books, for all we know. Like, I don't think it all is, because some of it's kind of personal to him. And I'll tell you another really cool piece of trivia. But first of all, just an aside about this Churchillian drift. Just to interject a warning to your viewers, right? The internet is absolutely awash.
Replete.
I hate to replete with misattributed quotes. And there are a bunch that people attribute to Marcus Aurelius over and over again that happens so often that you then eventually they find a way into books, and so you'll buy books. And
what are the most?
He never said that.
What are the most misattributed Marcus Aurelius quotes?
What are the most? There's one that says everything you see is just a perspective or something like that, which doesn't even make sense semantically. You don't see a perspective, you see through a perspective, right? Isn't he? I'm like, geez, Marcus Aurelius would never write that. That's nonsense. But he wouldn't say that anyway, because it's kind of extreme relativism, and Marcus would say, no, that might be true of some things, but that Marcus believed that there are certainties in life. Like, he thought there were moral certainties in life. Now, I was going to say something I've forgotten what I was going to say, Chris, about Epictetus, or maybe it doesn't matter. The Churchillian drift we were talking about, and the quotes that are attributed to Marcus Aurelius, not necessarily from him. That was very common in the ancient world. The ideas end up. We only have about 1% of ancient literature surviving today, so of course we're probably misattributing loads of ideas.
Is the whole universe's change and life itself is but what you deem it? Is that him?
I'm going to say yes and no. Because I think he would say himself that what he's doing there. I remember what I was going to tell you. Actually, it relates to this. You've given me a really good example. In Greek, that's just like 6 words. It's like really, really concise, right? And you can tell from the context that what he's saying is the universe's change is him referring to Heraclitus, and life is opinion is him referring to Epictetus. So he's trying to sum up his 2 favorite philosophers. I said earlier his favorite person to quote is Epictetus. His second favorite person to quote is Heraclitus. And so these are like his 2 favorite philosophers. And he's trying to sum up their philosophy in just like as few words as possible. So he can memorize it really easily. This is a kind of like, he's making up slogans for himself. This is a thing that the Stoics would do. So by the universe's change, he means what we call pantare, everything flows, like this kind of doctrine of impermanence that you find in the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus that the Stoics really loved. Life as opinion is a bit more obscure. It needs to be unpacked a bit. What he does not mean everything is just subjective. He's talking about when Epictetus says, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. What he means is the quality of your life is shaped fundamentally by certain opinions that you hold, predominantly your value judgments. So what he's saying is the things that you value and the things that you despise are going to shape your character and therefore the quality of your life. So unfortunately, you lose some meaning by trying to simplify and abbreviate things. That's what he's doing. He's trying to make it more memorable, but he's ended up saying something that people are bound to misinterpret.
Well, you have to sacrifice context for brevity, right? This is I'm a big fan of Naval Ravikant. I'm not sure if you've come across him.
No, I haven't.
Very, very cool guy. So he's a VC, angel investor, but also I guess he'd class himself as a sort of garage philosopher as well. And he's very, very pithy. So he's like an aphorism factory, and he's constantly putting out these really, really cool, short, sort of aphoristic things. And he says basically the same thing. Look, the point is for this to kind of be like a buoy in the water, and you know that below that there's tons and tons more stuff. It's kind of like just a little mental trigger. Look, this is the thing that you got to remember. There's a big concept. It's not worth just knowing the thing. You got to know the concept. But in order to remind you of the concept, here's the thing that sits above the water of it.
Epictetus says almost exactly the same thing in one of his discourses. He says if you ask us what the goal of life is, we'll say it's living in accord with nature. Or he says something else, actually. He says, but then if you ask us what does living mean and what does nature mean, it's going to take a lot longer to unpack like those concepts. So he says you can condense things down into a short slogan, like just a few words, but then you're going to have to explain what those words mean in order to avoid confusion. It's basically the same idea. It puts it really clearly. And it reminds me of the other little bit of trivia I was going to tell you. And this is just like a cool thing for people that are interested in the meditations, right? So first of all, a bit of background. I meet a surprising number of people who think that we don't know anything about Marcus Aurelius, which is really weird because he was a big deal back in the day. And one of the reasons I've written about him is we know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do about almost any other ancient philosopher. Certainly far more than we know about any other Stoic, because he was a Roman emperor. So we have like 3 major surviving histories of his reign. We have a bunch of archaeological evidence and inscriptions. We have references to him and loads of other writings. We have a record of his legal rescripts, like his legal agenda from the laws that he passed in Roman legal digests. But we also have a cache of letters that were found in the 19th century between Marcus and Marcus Cornelius Fronto, his rhetoric tutor that I mentioned earlier. And some people are disappointed by those letters because they're kind of mainly chit-chatting. They talk about their aches and pains and the weather and stuff like that. There's not a lot of philosophy in them. But at one point, and Fronto tends to talk about these rhetoric exercises that he's setting Marcus, like how to practice writing powerful speeches and how to phrase things effectively and stuff. But at one point, Fronto sets this exercise for Marcus, and he basically has this thing where Marcus is trying to decide whether he wants to spend his time studying rhetoric or studying philosophy. And Fronto is kind of struggling to persuade Marcus in order to retain his status at court as his main tutor. He was in competition, he says, with Rusticus, like to be Marcus's main tutor as he gradually got older and shifted more towards philosophy. And what Fronto says is very interesting. He says basically that philosophers come up with these insights that are kind of obscure by their very nature. So you think very deeply about things, you're going to come up with stuff that's kind of hard to put into words. It's going to seem like any original thought. It's going to be a little difficult to articulate at first. And he says, so the philosophers end up saying weird stuff, like they make up jargon and things like that, and they say things that are kind of obscure. And he says, if you want to really understand things, and if you want to communicate them effectively, you have to study rhetoric as well. Like, you're going to have to figure out how to take these paradoxical ideas and put them into plain English, basically, for your own benefit, as well as the benefit of other people. And he tells Marcus, you should take these insights and practice paraphrasing them repeatedly. So thinking of different metaphors, different words that you could use to try and get the meaning across. And you think, oh, that's cool. It's kind of like a rhetoric exercise. It also shows him trying to figure out a way that he can hang on to his position in court. So Marcus, don't just leave me and go off and do philosophy. You need rhetoric and philosophy, he wants to say. But also the really cool thing about it is when scholars first read that letter, and he returns to it a few times in other places, they thought, how weird is this? Because that looks like that's what he's doing in the Meditations. Like, in the Meditations, he's taking these paradoxical ideas, and it looks like he repeats them over and over again, like he's paraphrasing them. And it looks like he's doing this thing that Fronto tells him to do, where he's turning an idea over and over in his mind and trying to articulate it in different ways so he understands it from different perspectives.
That's the problem I think a lot of people have with the social media, Twitterverse when it comes to deploying wisdom, that it's all front and no substance, right? That people can use fancy rhetoric and fluent talking to cover up the fact that it's a baseless argument that they're putting across. So there isn't anything deeper than that. Fluency is used as a proxy for truthfulness or insight. Yeah,
it sucks. We need to do something about that. Like, social media is awesome, like, but all good things kind of have their pros and cons, right? And one of the disadvantages of it is that it really seems to, I think there are features of social media that have made people more angry and confrontational. And it seems to have kind of really damaged people's ability to engage in reasoned argument somehow. Like, you see way more kind of fallacies, like ad hominem attacks, sweeping generalizations and stuff on the internet than you'd normally expect to see just in an everyday conversation with other people. I think somehow it allows people to get away with saying irrational stuff more than, you'd be challenged perhaps a little bit more or in a more effective way in a normal face-to-face conversation. There's another thing that happens, which, Socrates said an odd thing about the sophists. Here's a bit of trivia not a lot of people know about Socrates, right? Socrates used to pretend that he had a bad memory. He was kind of famous for it. He'd be like, oh, I've got this really bad memory. And it was part of the Socratic irony. It was feigned. And the reason he did it was because the sophists were known for giving really long, elaborate speeches, right? And one of the risks of that is that often people disguise the weakest part of their argument by taking it for granted. It's like an unspoken premise. And then they'll build on it and build on it and build on it until everybody's kind of forgotten that the foundation was nonsense to begin with, right? And so Socrates would say, oh, interrupt the sophists all the time. He wouldn't let them go for more than a sentence or two. And he'd say, well, hang on a minute, let's just check like your starting point before we go any further. And that really aggravated them. Like, it was one of the things he was kind of known for. And it didn't sound cool to listen to. People thought, well, the sophists are more entertaining. You can be passive. You just sit there and let it kind of wash over you, like this colourful, like emotional speech and stuff. And Socrates kept interrupting them at the beginning and not even letting them get started. Because he'd say, but the thing that you're assuming right from the very beginning, like, do we know for certain that that's absolutely true? Or you've given this big speech about justice, but you haven't explained what justice means. Like, let's stop and just define the concepts that you're using before we even go any further.
I've got a quote from Zeno that may have had Churchillian drift on it, so I'm going to stress test it with you about this exact thing. Long, wordy, sophistic philosophical discussions were popular in ancient Rome and Greece. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, took a totally different approach and was super concise. When someone complained that his philosophical arguments were very abrupt, Zeno agreed and replied, "If I could, I'd abbreviate the syllables as well."
Yeah, and where he gets that from is the Spartans. So we say that someone is laconic if they're very kind of terse and abrupt. And Laconia is the region, like the county or whatever, where the city of Sparta was located. So laconic just means Spartan, right? The Spartans were known for speaking in this very concise, very brief way. And the Stoics and Socrates were kind of known for modeling themselves a bit on certain aspects of Spartan culture. There's a really good anecdote about a sophist and the Spartan king. So there was a sophist, and this must have been relatively unusual. He went to Sparta and he spoke to a Spartan king. I guess the Spartan king was like, I'm just going to find out what these guys are like. I thought I'd check it out. So this guy's invited to the court and he gives a big elaborate speech. And then he says at the end of it to the king, what did you think of that? And the king says, well, it went on so long by Spartan standards. He goes, I can't even remember the beginning. And therefore, I didn't understand the middle, and so I can't agree with your conclusion. Which is a very Socratic sounding things to say. He wants to kind of go right back to the beginning of the speech and say, well, let's just roll it back a bit and look at where you started. I mean, the easiest way to explain that is, like I said earlier, people talk about courage or justice or wisdom. They say a lot of things. There's a lot of hot air. But Socrates would say, well, hang on a minute. We need to define what you mean by those words before we start using them. Otherwise, we kind of get lost in the weeds. And we get lost in the weeds all the time on the internet.
Yeah, I wonder why you were talking about social media. I wonder why it is that people are able to make more obvious errors online. Maybe part of it is that the immediate social cost of doing something, like you would see it in someone's face. If you start to stray or make a fallacy, you'll see someone go like that almost immediately. Whereas on the internet, you're a little bit more detached. It's bizarre because on the internet, certain things are scrutinized more because the bandwidth is lower and it's this sort of staccato. I say a thing, then you prepare and you say a thing, then I prepare and I say a thing. So some of the stuff is more scrutinized, but some of the stuff is a lot less scrutinized and able to be sort of slipped in a little bit more easily, especially when emotions are running high. What do you think Marcus Aurelius would say about the current state of the internet and social media and tribalism and stuff like that?
I think he'd have a lot to say about it. It may surprise people. I mean, he'd talk about many aspects, some of the things that you've just touched on. He'd say maybe on social media, people are less able to interrupt you. Maybe also you're not seeing their facial expression and stuff. You can also just ignore them. There are many people that put stuff out in social media and never read any of the responses. So they're just kind of like spewing stuff out, but they're not really. In psychotherapy, that to me sets alarm bells ringing. Because people kind of need the socializing effect of getting feedback from other people. We need critics. We need disagreement in order to knock the rough edges off our thinking, basically. But some people are so kind of narcissistic, or they just want to put stuff out and not get any kind of feedback on it. And which is the opposite in the sense of the peer review method in science. Science is all about you put stuff out there and then you let everyone tear it to shreds. And that's kind of like how we learn stuff. But there are definitely intellectuals that avoid doing that, like the plague. They don't present their ideas at conferences, they don't engage with their critics and stuff like that. One of the things the Stoa is named after this public space in the Agora, when the other philosophers had kind of retreated to some extent to these more private schools outside the city walls. The Stoics went, no, we're going back to where Socrates did philosophy, out in the marketplace, so that anybody can come along and tell us that they think we're talking rubbish. And they can pick holes in our ideas, because we want to engage with other people. We want to hear their criticisms rather than being afraid of it. There's a really cool quote actually from a rival school, from the Epicureans, but the Stoics say similar things. Marcus Aurelius says similar things to us. Epicurus said something deeply paradoxical. He said, in a philosophical debate, everybody wants to be the winner, right? But ironically, the person who benefits the most from a philosophical debate is the person who loses the argument. And that's a beautiful paradox. The guy that wins the argument doesn't really gain anything, but the guy that loses the argument potentially learns something. So Epicurus is like, why are you so desperate to win? Like, Socrates actually talks as if he wants to be refuted. He kind of wants other people to disprove things because he thinks there's, that's almost like getting vitamins in your mind or something. There's something nourishing and healthy about that. I think the other thing that Marcus would say that's related to this, and this might surprise people, unless they've just heard me saying it lots already, I think Marcus would find the internet, the striking thing about the internet is the amount of rage and anger and hatred and spite and stuff that's on it, and passive aggressiveness and things. And the Stoics differ from modern psychotherapists. I mean, this has made me realize in a way this is a shortcoming of my profession of modern psychotherapy. Let me back up and explain a little. The Stoics thought that the Stoics did psychotherapy. They straight up just did psychotherapy. They wrote books called On Therapy. Some people find that hard to believe. Like, most of those books are lost now, apart from one by Seneca, which is called On Anger, which is on Stoic therapy for anger. And they thought the most urgent emotional problem to address was anger. Now, usually we talk roughly of there being three broad categories of negative emotion: anger, fear, and sadness, right? So, or anger, anxiety, and depression, if you like, right? Clinicians, therapists, predominantly see people with anxiety disorders and clinical depression, or some combination thereof. And there might be bits of anger, but people that predominantly suffer from anger tend not to seek therapy, right? So therapy has a kind of self-selecting audience to some extent. Angry people think, you need therapy, buddy. Like, not me. So they're less likely to go and seek therapy. Where you see angry people is in institutions, like in prisons, in schools, in the military, because somebody else says, buddy, you've got an anger problem. You need to go and see a counsellor or a therapist about that. But angry people are generally resistant to seeking help because they think they're in the right. There's a righteousness about it. They think they're in the right. I think for that reason, one of the risks of modern self-help, the internet is also awash with self-help, self-improvement advice. I think the downside of that is that people potentially focus all of their attention in the wrong areas and neglect like the place where they're actually wounded the most deeply. So I'm surprised how little discussion there is in self-improvement communities about anger. Like, it kind of comes in, but it's not usually the main focus. And often people that talk about self-improvement do it in quite an angry, it's surprising how hostile they can be in their conversations, like in YouTube comments and stuff like that. It's like, that's where the biggest blind spot is. And for that reason, I like to call it the royal road to self-improvement. If people could just get past that blind spot and realize that's the biggest opportunity, like, for actually transforming our character, because it's the most neglected part of our personality, and the Stoics knew that.
Working on anger is the biggest opportunity.
Working on anger, I think so.
What do you think the Stoics would say about dealing with depression and anxiety?
Yeah, they think those are equally also very important areas. Like, their main focus is on anger, but they think depression and anxiety are important as well. The Stoics, I mean, let's talk about some specific things that I think are actually helpful in practice. I like to chat and talk about trivia and things, but it's also good to just give people some practical takeaways, right? So in terms of coping with anxiety, there are a bunch of things. The Stoics have many, many techniques, actually. One of them is, we call it the view from above, like this idea of broadening your perspective. They were so far ahead of their time in comprehending this. So they would visualize the world as if seen from Mount Olympus, or try and visualize the cosmos as a whole. Whenever they're talking about cosmology in ancient philosophy, in a sense, they're visualizing the whole of time and space. Marcus talks about this quite a lot as a psychological technique. In fact, at one point he says he does it every day, if you can imagine the effect of doing something like that every day. Now, what I'd say about that is that we know now that when people become anxious or angry and also or depressed, they exhibit cognitive biases. And usually we don't realize that we have those biases because we're looking at the world through the biases. So it's like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Like, we're too biased to notice our own biases. Right? And so when people are anxious, they engage in threat monitoring, as it's sometimes called. So their focus of attention becomes quite narrow and quite selective, and they'll look for reasons to worry. Same as angry people look for things to be pissed off about. Like anxious people look for things to be frightened of, right? It's easy to see other people doing that, right? I mean, like when you look at other people and they're anxious or angry, you think that guy's just looking for stuff to get angry about. It's obvious, but we don't realize when we're doing it ourselves because we're biased. We need other people to tell us that we're looking at things in a really biased, very selective way. The Stoics realized that when we broaden our perspective spatially, chronologically, it helps to counteract this narrowing of attention that we tend to see in extreme emotions. And one of the dilemmas in modern psychotherapy is that when people have troubling thoughts, when they get upset, they usually go to one extreme or the other. So either they ruminate, right? So if somebody has an anxious thought that pops into their mind, either they spend way too much time going over and over it, like we call that the worrying cognitive style. So they'll go, what if this happens? What if that happens? How am I going to cope with it? What will I do? And they won't get to sleep for hours. They'll be lying in bed at night for hours, like thinking about it, right? Going round and round and round in circles. Or they do the opposite, Chris. And a thought pops in their mind, what if I go bankrupt? What if my wife leaves me or something? And they go, I mustn't think about that. I have to block it from my mind. So they attempt thought suppression, as we call it, and try and avoid thinking about it. So they either overthink it or they avoid thinking about it. And those are both highly toxic ways of coping with distressing information or ideas. And usually what happens is people kind of ricochet back and forth between either overthinking things or being extremely avoidant. And you see this all the time. And the sad thing is there's got to be a via media. There has to be another way, a third option. And the third option is to allow yourself to acknowledge the information or the thought, but in a more detached way. And one way of doing that is by gaining what we call cognitive distancing. So realizing it's just a kind of arbitrary thought, like viewing it almost like from the side, like, and go, oh, Donald's telling himself that he could go bankrupt, or Donald's telling himself his marriage could collapse, or something like that. So you get a sense of objectivity about your own thoughts by stepping to one side and noticing them like that. Aaron T. Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, said it's like you're looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses, or, catastrophe-tinted glasses in this case. And instead of looking through them and just thinking that's how the world looks, it'd be like you took them off and looked at them and went, oh, I see now those are the lenses that I was looking through, right? But another way of doing something similar is to broaden your perspective. And that allows you, that's not avoiding the thought, you're still acknowledging the thought. And it's not over-analyzing it and going round in circles. You're not really engaging with it. You're just shifting your perspective. The key often, what both of those techniques have in common is that you continue to accept the thought, but you're shifting the perspective that you have on it. And that allows us to avoid this overthinking at one extreme or avoidant thought suppression way of coping at the other end. That's a takeaway that I'd like to kind of give people. It's very simple. Learn to accept upsetting thoughts, but from a different perspective.
Is that slightly more for anxiety than depression, or for both?
I think what we know, I hesitate to say these words because there's no panacea, but the closest thing that we have to a panacea in modern research in psychotherapy is cognitive distancing. We know that it works for anxiety and depression and really a whole bunch of different things. And these strategies function in a slightly different way for different problems. But this is used in the treatment of clinical depression. It can be used for anger as well. Now, these are pretty general purpose strategies. They're tied up with what we call over the past 20 years or so, the third wave in psychotherapy, in evidence-based, research-based psychotherapy, and the move toward, which was influenced in part by Buddhist mindfulness meditation practices. So let me, in very plain English, everybody would know when you do mindfulness meditation and a thought pops in you're sitting there cross-legged with your jaw sticks, Chris, and your beads on and all that, and suddenly a thought pops in your mind. You suddenly think, hang on a minute, what if nobody likes me, everybody hates me, or something like that? Because random thoughts just pop into our mind like that, like background noise. When you're meditating, you wouldn't think, geez, what am I going to do about that? Why is that? Is it something to do with my upbringing? So then you wouldn't be meditating anymore, right? And you also wouldn't think, oh, I have to stop thinking about that. Like, get rid of that thought. Like, quick, drink some whiskey or take some drugs or something. Like, let's kind of distract myself. When you're meditating, you'd naturally think, I have to acknowledge that thought, but then just do nothing in response to it. Like I just allow it to pass through my mind like the weather. Like, and so it's natural when you're meditating that you adopt a detached perspective to intrusive thoughts. And so for that reason, researchers were very interested in studying that and looking at other ways it could be utilized. In terms of broadening the perspective, I'll give you, this is my favorite cognitive therapy takeaway, right? Because like there are techniques we use in therapy. I used to train therapists for a living, like for a long time in the UK. Some of the techniques we get therapists to do are pain in the ass to teach. Like they're complicated, and it's some things that some people find easier to do than others. And then there's other techniques we use in therapy that are so simple. I don't know why we don't teach them to kids. Like they're like idiot-proof therapy techniques. And one of them is to say what happens next. So especially with chronic worriers. So when people worry, they'll think about feared catastrophes in the future, and they'll keep replaying them over and over in their mind. But the weird thing about it is they'll focus on the worst part of an incident. And you have to ask yourself, why do you choose to begin at that point and end at that point? It's arbitrary, right? If you're thinking about your future, you could expand the duration of the clip so that it encompasses weeks or months or years or whatever. But you amplify your anxiety if you focus on the setback or the worst part, and then you don't think about what would happen after. And you also prevent yourself from planning coping behavior, right? So it's a really dysfunctional thing to do. It's got to do with the editing of the video, if you like, in your mind. Why would you choose that time slice? Like that's what's kind of pathological about it. So in therapy, all we have to do is to say, well, suppose that you did go bankrupt. What would probably happen next? And then they might say, well, I'd sit at home and I'd cry a lot. And then you say, so suppose you did go bankrupt and you sat at home and you cried a lot. What would probably happen next? And then someone might say, well, I'd have to start thinking of ways that I could kind of start another business or find a job or something like that. And they say, okay, suppose that you did that, then what would probably happen next? And you just keep asking that question over and over. It forces them to broaden their chronological perspective. And usually that dilutes the feeling of anxiety because they're now thinking about not just the worst part, but also bits where they're beginning to move on. So the anxiety's reduced. But it also forces them to problem solve, as we call it, and think of potential ways of coping, which is maybe something that they hadn't really, taken time to think through previously. So just keep asking yourself, suppose even if that did happen, what would probably happen next? And just nudge yourself past that initial catastrophic movie clip.
I like the fact that you're kind of front-loading hedonic adaptation into the mind right now. The studies say that a year after someone's become disabled or won the lottery, baseline happiness tends to go back to a similar sort of level as it was before. I'm not sure whether that's how well researched and studied that is, but certainly in my life, when I think about when really good things have happened or when really bad things have happened, after a long enough time span, life kind of feels the same. I ruptured my Achilles about 2 years ago, and the rehab period sucked and it was boring or whatever, but there was actually points of the recovery that I really enjoyed. There was points of the recovery where I got real senses of satisfaction, very, very good feelings from making progress. So, it's like a double-edged sword.
Well, you're doing something, I think, in a sense, there are two types of people in the world, right? There are people that learn from experience and people that don't. So there are people, especially, I think, I'm kind of being slightly glib, but I think once you kind of reach around about 40, you suddenly, you potentially sit down and kind of look back on how your life has gone so far. And you kind of notice patterns and things in retrospect. And that is fundamentally a kind of wisdom. But some people don't seem to do that. They don't seem to do that at all. Whereas other people very naturally, like you're doing, will just review. So, I had this accident. And then, how was it after that? And I kind of adapted to it. And that's how things panned out. And then you start to realize, well, maybe that's what's going to happen in the future when I encounter other setbacks.
Well, the bottom line is that no matter what's happened to you, all of the fears that you had, all of the nightmares, all of the concerns and worry and sleepless nights and all that stuff, anybody that's listening to this right now inevitably made it through that challenge because they're here to listen to this right now. You have proof for however many years and decades you've been alive on the planet, that no matter what the challenge was, you managed to get through it by the fact that you're still here.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that we like to do, worry is one of, actually, my specialism is, you mentioned anxiety. I specialize in treating anxiety disorders as a therapist, mainly in social anxiety, but other types of anxiety as well. And one of my favorite pieces of research on worry is that when you get people to keep worry diaries and just write all the stuff that they're freaking out about down, like keep a record of it, and then you kind of review it just for research purposes. Really. Sometimes the things that researchers do just to gather information end up being accidentally therapeutic. So if we say, well, like, what percentage of those things actually happened, or what percentage of them were as bad as you thought they were going to be? People go, oh, like, no, actually, most of it never happened. And like, how much time, like, how many hours have you spent over your life worrying about stuff that ended up not actually happening? Or if it did happen, you coped better, or it wasn't as awful as you thought it was going to be. And people will go, geez, I had like a large fraction of my life, like in retrospect, has probably been spent worrying about stuff unnecessarily. And when you have that realization, Chris, when the scales drop from your eyes, like, and you actually, it's one thing someone telling you that, but it's nothing looking back in your life and going, geez, yeah, like loads of wasted time, wasted years, like worrying about stuff that didn't even happen. Like, it makes you feel differently about the future and about things that are worrying you in the present, right?
Speaking about depression and anxiety and stuff, just how crazy was Nero?
I mean, like, well, first of all, I'll preface that I'm always surprised when people get upset on the internet. It's where they go to get upset about how we can't be certain about a lot of things in history. And I think, gee, I thought everyone took this for granted. Like, this is a premise of the conversation is we can't really know 100% for sure, right? So we're just basing it on what survives and stuff. But personally, I think Nero was pretty crazy. Like, subsequent generations of Romans really vilified him. I mean, Marcus Aurelius uses him as an example of somebody who's crazy, a tyrant, and just dominated by his own anger and anxiety. So he uses Nero as like as code for that, as like an example of that. I mean, I think Nero was a car crash, and one of the reasons was Nero, like, kind of instigated the Second Sophistic. He loved Greek culture, and he wanted to be an actor, famously, and he would force people to come and applaud him. Like, they created a special cohort, like, of soldiers, like, who would round people up at these festivals that he held, and they'd stand around them with swords, and like they had to applaud Nero on stage, like reciting poetry and things like that. I mean, how fascistic, like, is that? It's like the Nuremberg rallies or something like that. We're going to execute you unless you applaud this terrible play that Nero's written or whatever, right? It's crazy. But I think part of the craziness of it is, you know, people talk a lot actually these days about narcissism. Like, I mean, obviously it's always been a thing, but it's easy. One of the things that we've always known is that narcissistic individuals have a magnetism and charisma to them often. And that's true throughout history. Like, so Nero was a raging narcissist. Of course, like, even from just what I've told you, right, it's clear this guy is a raging, you know, narcissist. And I think that's kind of part of the craziness. You become... This is one of the fundamental things that the Stoics really warn us against, is being too preoccupied with winning approval from other people, like too preoccupied with what other people think of us. Nero's the extreme example of that going wrong.
So he's a vulnerable narcissist, not a grandiose narcissist, then, based on what the literature would say?
Yeah, he ended up committing suicide.
He was only 40 or something, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was relatively young. He became emperor when he was very young, when he was a teenager. And so the later Romans would say one of the things that concerned them is if Marcus was concerned about Commodus also being a very young emperor. And he said, like, this hasn't got a good track record. Like, and actually, a similar thing happened to Commodus. I always think there's kind of like several ways that a Roman emperor can maintain power. Like, it's difficult. It's a challenge, a daily challenge for how do you hang on to power in the Roman Empire. You could be assassinated. There could be a civil war. So ideally, you want the army to love you and be on your side. That helps. Julius Caesar had the army on his side. Like that, Ben, he wasn't an emperor; he was a precursor of the emperors, but he had the army on his side. Marcus Aurelius didn't have the army on his side initially. Like he hadn't served in the military, but he seems to have really won them over. Like by the end, like they seem to have come to really revere him. You want to have the Senate on your side. Like some emperors treated the senators like trash. They executed them. Like they had purges of them. Whereas like Hadrian, for example, had terrible purges where he persecuted the senators. They Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius saw themselves as working alongside the Senate more. They were viewed as kind of almost like the senators, like part of that, like sharing power with them and so on. If you don't have the Senate on your side and you don't have the army on the side, you need to have the general public on your side. And the way that people did that in part was through almost turning themselves into celebrities in ancient Rome and throwing expensive gladiatorial contests to like having TV shows today, also like reality TV. They would have these expensive public performances, festivals, like games to try and kind of win over the public and impress them. And I think everybody knew that was the most toxic way to try to hang on to power, like because the popularity like that tends to be fickle. Like people end up having to do stuff that's not really anything to do with running the state. Like these guys like Nero and Commodus seem to kind of forget about actually running the state, and they become much more preoccupied with appearances. And it usually leads to assassination, or them being overthrown in the end. And I think Marcus would have been horrified to realize the first thing that Commodus did when Marcus died was he abandoned the army, like he alienated the Senate, and he dressed himself up. He had all these statues built of himself with a lion skin, the Nemean lion, like he was pretending that he was the god Hercules. And he became a megalomaniac. Like he wanted people to worship him, and he went and fought in these gladiatorial contests, like you see in the Ridley Scott movie. Like he was desperate to, like he fought in the Colosseum, like being a reality TV star or something like that. Like,
did you see
it ended in disaster?
Did you see the Netflix series? I think it's called Roman Empire.
Yeah, with Commodus in it.
I must have watched each season of that 5 times. I don't know how historically accurate it is, but it is so entertaining. For me, that style of documentary that Netflix does, they've done World War II in color and the great events of World War II in HD, where you've got archive footage or actors playing out what's going on, interspersed with experts and historians talking about it. Dude, I could if that was all that was on TV, I'd be happy with that for the rest of time. It's so cool.
I remember watching that and thinking the dramatizations are often kind of inaccurate in some ways, but that doesn't bother me because I think, it's a dramatization. I remember watching that and thinking I kind of like the dramatizations better than I like the talking head experts sometimes in it. Like I kind of, I thought some of the things that they were saying I didn't entirely agree with. But I love watching things like that. When we were researching the graphic novel, I didn't read that. I never read that many graphic novels. And so I sat down and I thought, I'm going to read a big pile of graphic novels. And I thought, geez, man, my job sucks. I've got to go to the library and just read comics all day. But I couldn't do it. I found them kind of tedious. I was kind of struggling to get into it.
I've never got into them either.
Yeah. And then I thought, what I need to do is actually, sometimes you've got to approach things in a slightly roundabout way. So to research our graphic novel, I watched loads of movies. I rewatched loads of movies. I watched these kind of TV series that you're talking about. And I looked at them from the perspective of how could we do something similar in a comic book format. So I didn't get inspiration from other comics. I got inspiration much more from films and TV series.
Well, because you need to do the same thing, right? You need to set a scene. Where's the perspective? Where's the camera? Where are the protagonists? So on and so forth. What's the backdrop going to look like?
Or you can do. I mean, I think it's possible to do a graphic novel. I didn't even realize this at first. But of course, you can have a graphic novel where it's just a bunch of stickmen talking if you really wanted. And you just dump a load of dialogue in it. But at the beginning, I thought, we can't do that, right? I don't want to do that. I want to have a story about Marcus Aurelius where there's a lot of action. And I want to have philosophy in it, but where we kind of try and weave it into the action more. So actually, if you took all the philosophy out of it, it would still be a really cool story. Like, I don't want a bunch of like stick men or a bunch of men in togas just like talking to each other loads. I want the philosophy to kind of emerge from the action more.
I started reading a guy called Jed McKenna last year, and he's got a book called Spiritual Enlightenment Now. So he's a guy that says that he's awakened and is basically speaking stream of consciousness about what his life's like. He's running some sort of convent-y type thing in America, and I really, really fell in love with it. Whether the guy is awakened or not, completely, fully, the separation of self from everything else, like all of that, everything, he's reached it. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter, because the writing to me is just so spectacular. And in it, he has this concept that he calls releasing the tiller. And he talks about how when you're in a boat, the tiller is the thing that's attached to the rudder. It's what you steer with. And he talks about how most people grip the tiller very, very hard, and uses this analogy in sailing that if you're sailing through a storm, one of the best ways to actually maneuver the boat is to allow the tiller to maneuver itself, because the boat will find the easiest path up and over the waves. And he keeps on talking about that. And then I had Ryan Holiday on last year, and I mentioned it to him, and he was like, that's a lot like amor fati, sort of loving your fate, about releasing the tiller, allowing yourself to be sort of carried a little bit more. And I never got to speak to Ryan that much about that concept, although I did a little bit of research. So I wondered if you could take me through what I need to know about loving your fate, and where it came from, and what your reflections have been on it.
Because I've got two things that pop into my mind immediately, and one of them is a bit of trivia for you, but you asked me, where does it come from? So that phrase comes from Nietzsche, who was we think of him as a philosopher, but he was a professor of classical philology by profession, like of ancient languages. And as far as I know, no one has ever been able to trace that phrase, amor fati, to any surviving Latin text, right? So either it's a kind of like a phrase that Nietzsche just coined himself, which sounds odd because it sounds very similar it really does sound very similar to things that Marcus Aurelius says. So it couldn't sound more Stoic, although Nietzsche, paradoxical as he is, often is kind of quite critical of Stoics, but seems to really rip off their ideas like really blatantly in other ways, right? So for a long time I thought it's just this thing that Nietzsche came up with. And then I realized actually, although there's not a Latin version, there's a Greek version of that phrase. And I think it's storga tikun or something like that in Greek. And it's in Johannes Stabaeus, if I remember rightly, in the list of maxims that come from the Delphic Oracle. So people thought the Delphic Oracle was a woman. Again, another weird paradox. We think of Greek philosophy as mainly men. The Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, was a woman, and the god Apollo supposedly spoke through her, like she was possessed by him or something. And we have all these maxims. There's like 160 odd that survive, like know thyself, all things in moderation, and the famous ones. And one of them is love your fate. And Plutarch, who was a famous philosopher, but also a priest of Apollo at Delphi, right? He says that the Pythia comes out with these things that are like koans. They're like these, most of them are 2 words in Greek. And they're very, very condensed. And he said, but people have written books about philosophy many volumes long, discussing them. So they're like seeds that philosophy grows out of and becomes very verbose. To go back to what we were talking about earlier, I mean, normally it's the other way around. Marcus is taking this complex philosophy and compressing it into short phrases. But Plutarch says she would just spit out these 2 words, and then people would go away and try and figure out what they meant and come up with like, lots of different versions. For example, Gnothai Seauton was written and engraved in the entrance to the Temple of Apollo. And people think it means kind of mindfulness or like investigating your own character and stuff like that. It's a kind of a recurring theme in Greek philosophy, particularly in Socrates. But Seneca and Plutarch both say it's a memento mori. They say that know thyself means know that you are mortal. Because it's what you read as you're walking into the Temple of Apollo at the entrance before you're about to be in the presence of the immortal god Apollo. So remember that you're not an immortal. So
it's
you're just
not
flesh and blood.
It's not to do with introspective work, reflections.
It could be all of that. It could be both, right? So I guess that's what Plutarch means as well. Is she just says something cryptic that sounds really cool. And some people take it away to mean you've got to really investigate yourself and explore a character. And other people say, no, it means something completely different, but equally profound about remembering that you're like finite and mortal and stuff like that. So, yeah, like that's, I think it's really cool, this idea that people say philosophy is dominated by men, but maybe there was a woman that was just kind of like pressing the buttons and initiating it all.
Have you read The Immortality Key by Brian Muraresku?
The one about the cookie on, like, here's another, we're on a trivia roll now, Chris.
I'm fine with
that. Did you know that Marcus Aurelius had hardly been out of Rome? Then he went and fought along the Danube in Austria, Hungary, and these countries. And then he eventually toured the east of the empire towards the end of his life, and he went to Athens. And during the height of the war, we're told, he made a vow that he was going to go to Eleusis, just outside Athens, and be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. And that must have meant that he drank the cookion, which is this small quantity of liquid, which some people believe contains something like ergot, like it's kind of precursor of LSD, because it's the cult of Demeter, the grain mother, or the earth mother, the goddess of wheat and grain, and ergot grows naturally on wheat. And so they believe that over the centuries they created this hallucinogenic kind of liquid based on ergot that people drank as part of the ceremony. And it's weird to think that Marcus Aurelius may have drank it.
That's cool. I mean, I spoke to Brian, and his work's fascinating. He's such an impressive guy. I was in Guatemala about 2 months ago, picking up my American visa, and I went out for dinner with this guy that watches the show, and he's got a huge YouTube channel in Spanish, and he was telling me that Brian is completely fluent in Spanish. He almost completely fluent in Portuguese. He is a full-time solicitor or some other, some sort of law professor, and also is researching the Eleusinian mysteries at the same time, and flying all over and going to Athens and trying to work out what's going on with ergot. And I was just really, really impressed with it. What are your thoughts? Do you think that this is legit? Do you think that they would have had a psychedelic brew that would have perhaps been a sacred ritual that many of the philosophers of the day went to do a tribute at?
I don't know. I'm kind of keeping an open mind, but I think it's like uncertain. I definitely think it's possible. And he says something actually that's true, which is generally, if you speak to people in Greece, they're kind of more sympathetic to it. They're like, yeah, sure, of course. Like, so there's maybe less of a stigma around it. But I don't. Who knows, like, whether it actually happened or not? We don't really know. When Marcus did that was almost certainly after he finished writing the Meditations.
Oh yeah, that's something that we didn't quite clarify earlier on. So you mentioned that he's doing it when he's in basically modern day Austria. It's freezing cold, but what's the time period? Is this over a long span of time, or is this kind of condensed information that he has?
When he wrote the Meditations?
Yes.
Like our best guess, I could talk all day about the little bits of evidence that contribute towards this. There are bits of evidence that we can use to date the Meditations within a certain boundary. Like, for example, here's a cool bit of trivia. Like, at one point he says, at Condensing, which is the main legionary fortress in modern-day Austria on the Danube. Now, when I went to Condensing for a week doing research, and I spoke to the director of archaeology there, and I said, have you found any stuff here that might be relevant to Marcus Aurelius? Because often archaeological remains don't tell us that much about, philosophers' theories and things like that, right? Or kind of like specific stuff that we get from the text. But they found a grave marker for a Praetorian Guard that's dated 171 AD. And the Praetorian Guards were the emperor's personal bodyguards. So that strongly suggests that Marcus must have been in Condensing in 171 AD, which kind of squares with other bits of evidence that we have. So he says, I'm in Condensing. When he wrote that in the Meditations, it may have been round about that time. Specifically, I think he probably wrote it between roughly 171 and about 174 AD. And then the Civil War happened. And I think that kind of marks like the end of it, roughly.
But
He was also
is that not a bit of a shame, the fact that, Marcus had a bunch more life to live and potentially lessons to accumulate that aren't written down?
Yeah, I mean, maybe he went and drank the cookie and thought, I've changed my mind about all this stuff that I wrote.
Bullshit, burn it.
Like, I mean, it kind of looks like, especially the people say the view from above, they've thought seems kind of trippy and psychedelic. Like some of the passages in the meditations, they can imagine that he might have taken hallucinogenic substances before he wrote it. He took opium, but it seems like it was probably in quite small quantities. Galen says he asked to reduce the dose, if I remember rightly, because it was making him too drowsy. He took it for insomnia and like a chronic chest and stomach pain that he was suffering.
People thought he had a stomach ulcer, right? That was one of the...
He may have. Like, we're kind of guessing, but he talks about these pains and spitting blood and stuff, so he may have had an ulcer. He was pretty frail. There's a later Roman author that describes him centuries later in retrospect. He says he had diaphanous, transparent skin. Like, so they certainly had this image of him as being kind of, like, very frail. And, like, it's often the case, though, isn't it? Sometimes there are guys that are super fit and athletic, and then they drop dead, like, in their 30s or whatever. And then there's other guys that are really sickly and frail, and they outlive everybody.
I mean,
and Marcus was one of these.
Warren Buffett has a McDonald's every single day. I think that's what he attributes his
longevity
level
to.
of relaxation. I'm not really too sure. So going back to the amor fati thing, a lot of Stoicism is built around preparing for death. How do you think Marcus felt as he was dying and as death approached him?
When I was writing the graphic novel, one of the things that changed a bit my perception of Marcus was I just sat up one day from working on it, and I just suddenly dawned on me, I thought, this guy must have really just woken up every morning and kind of pinched himself and thought, am I still alive? Because everyone was dropping dead from the plague, this kind of variant of smallpox, we believe it was, the Antonine Plague. He lost many friends and family members. He had 14 kids and half of them died before him. Fronto and Rusticus died. He could have been assassinated at any moment. There was a civil war against him. And then he stationed himself in the Danube at a place where we're told 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed in one day, and what would have been one of the worst defeats in Roman military history, but probably before he went there. So he was putting himself in danger militarily as well. It's like for a bunch of reasons. Like, so when he's meditating on death in the meditations, I think it's interesting to realize that he was, just to put it bluntly, in an incredibly dangerous and precarious situation.
This
himself.
Isn't some abstract idea. He's meditating on something that is at the forefront of his existence every day.
I mean, have you ever been in a dangerous situation and you kind of opinion, you thought, geez, I actually survived that? Like, I feel like Marcus did that every day. Like, he must have thought, wow, like, I'm still here. You know, I've survived many outbreaks, this horrible plague and stuff. So it wasn't at all abstract for him. And like, the other weird thing is, like I say, because he was frail, I think people, and because he was famous, I think he was surrounded by people waiting for him to die. He actually talks about that a bit in the meditations. So imagine what it would be like to have people gossiping all the time, but when do you think he's going to die? Like, I don't know, he's coughing all the time. He looks really frail. He's going to keel over any minute. Like, imagine that's all the conversation that's going on around you, man, like for decades. Like, and so in the meditation, she's like, I don't know, like maybe they're right. Like, you know, like maybe I'm going to keel over any minute. I think he had more opportunity than any of us to come to terms with his own mortality.
Okay, so let's say that you're a Stoic and you're meditating on death. Let's also say that death is at the forefront of your existence. How do you not descend into a more hedonic style of living?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, my experience is that that's not what it leads to, although I guess for some people it can. First of all, let's preface that by saying the Stoics thought that meditating on death would lead you to embrace reason more as a guide to life. And I think part of it is to do with this kind of broadening of perspective that we mentioned earlier. It comes from the fact that I think when we contemplate our own mortality, what goes hand in hand with that is thinking about our life as a whole, rather than, becoming too preoccupied with like moment to moment existence. When you're lying on your deathbed, you naturally tend to look back over your life as a whole. And I guess what the Stoics are doing is this kind of paradoxical balancing act, where on the one hand they want us to be really grounded in the present, but also kind of at the back of our minds also have this expansive awareness of the whole of space and time. They want us to have our cake and eat it, Chris. Like, they want us to be grounded in the present, but also aware of the totality of existence as the context within which the present moment takes place. And I think that changes the way that we perceive transient pleasures. Let me explain why. I'm going to say something that I think is very profound, because Marcus Aurelius says it, right? There are many things over the years that I've learned in philosophy and psychology, and some of it what I've learned is some of the things that sound really deep and profound are usually BS, and not that deep, when you kind of dig into them. But then, often the most profound things are kind of relatively simple. Marcus talks at one point about how when people desire things, in a sense, what they're doing is imagining the presence of something that's currently absent. What if I had a really nice car? I don't have a really nice car, but I'm imagining what it'd be like if I did have one. It's hypothetical. He says everyone does that kind of naturally. But he says, what if you do the opposite and you imagine the absence of things that are currently present? Then, rather than desire, you experience gratitude, right? It's a cool, neat little rhetorical way of putting it, right? But there's also something much deeper going on there. Because if we expand our perspective so we acknowledge a broader context, then in addition to experiencing the presence of the things that we currently have, at the back of our mind or at the periphery of our awareness, we have to acknowledge there was a time before and there will be a time after this experience. So we experience the presence and absence of something simultaneously by broadening our perspective. Sure, I have it now, but there was a time when I didn't have this, and one day it will be gone. One day I'll be gone. So we experience the presence, the pure presence of the present moment, but enveloped in this kind of nothingness or absence of individual things, but also of our entire life. And I think that when we broaden our perspective and we experience presence and absence of ourselves and the things we're enjoying simultaneously, it dilutes the intensity of our emotional experience. And I mean that in a good way. It kind of brings it within rational bounds, I would say. And it's the same if you're experiencing pain or discomfort, or pleasure. I think that perspective allows you to enjoy pleasure without being consumed by it, without it becoming too much of an indulgence, without losing perspective. I guess that's a good way of phrasing it. It allows us to keep perspective on the things that are causing us pain or pleasure.
Naval Ravikant says that desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want.
Yeah, the Stoics kind of say that as well. They talk about as being, and in modern psychology, this is the formula really for anxiety. It's future focused. The anxiety, fear is the belief that something bad is going to happen, or that we're going to be deprived of something that we desire. And a lot of fear is predicated on the stuff that we value. Like you say, so in terms of society, most people that live in the first world are consumed with anxiety about losing stuff that our parents never had to begin with. When I was a kid growing up, I love being able to say this now, we used to walk to school in the snow with no shoes and all that. When I was a kid, everything was made of wood and cost 2 pence, back in the old days. But when I was a kid growing up in Scotland, we really didn't have that much. We didn't have the internet, if I wanted to get books that were hard, it was hard to obtain books on philosophy in the small town that I lived in. And now we kind of take more and more stuff for granted, but we also live in abject terror of being deprived of these things. Whereas, it would just bring us back to the level of people throughout most of human history who were fairly content not to have central heating and the internet and the microwave oven and all this kind of stuff. Becoming overly attached to these things, we really set ourselves up for fear and anxiety and depression. it's crazy how you see people who are very wealthy and successful, and then they lose it and commit suicide. And you think, but you still had more money than the majority of people, like, and more opportunity and more success. Like, it's just that you had a relative loss in status. The Stoics want us to try and see through that and transcend it, I think.
Speaking of rich, powerful people, has cancel culture tried to come for Stoicism yet? I mean, it's a rich, white person, elitist philosophy.
I love all this stuff in a way. I just kind of find that, like most things, I think the key to life is paradox, isn't it? The key is to kind of, like I said before, about how can we accept a thought, but without, getting entangled with it. So there's got to be like a third way. I think we have to be able to laugh at some of this stuff, but also kind of take it seriously at the same time. You don't want to get too seriously. You don't want to laugh at it too much. But there's kind of a middle road. I mean, I think some of it's kind of absurd, right? The Stoics, usually what people say is like the opposite of the truth. So the Stoics were famous throughout, in ancient Greece anyway, as a foreign philosophy. Like, they were the immigrants. Zeno was shipwrecked. He was Phoenician. He's described as having dark skin. Even the word that you actually use is black, but it probably just means that he was quite dark skinned. He was perceived as foreign, like very foreign, and his philosophy was perceived as a foreign import to Athens. He was a metic legally, like a permanent resident or a foreign immigrant at Athens. He wasn't an Athenian citizen. And most of the subsequent teachers came from what we would describe as the Middle East, now from Asia Minor. So this idea that it's kind of this dominant tradition of white men is just historically not really accurate. It's if you really visualize what was going on, it's a philosophy of immigrants and people who were looked down on by the Athenians because they were foreigners at Athens. So it's just not factually accurate to begin with, is how I see it, ironically.
Well, pretty much everything is going to be trampled by the cancel culture mob at some point, so I'm sure that you'll probably have to defend some of the boundaries of Stoicism.
And the other thing they tend to say is it's a philosophy for the Roman elite, which is there's a grain of truth in that. There's more truth. First of all, there's both more and less truth in that than they realize. So first of all, Marcus Aurelius was elite. But they don't realize also that Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, was into Stoicism as well. Marcus wasn't the only emperor that was into Stoicism. And the others kind of dabbled in it a bit as well, like Nero, obviously, and Hadrian, although they weren't really Stoics themselves as such. But Stoicism was also a philosophy of poor people, certainly at one point. Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoic school, watered gardens at night for a living, like really cheap manual labor that he did. He was notoriously poor. He used to be a professional boxer. So he was this kind of, example of a poor working class dude, that became a famous philosopher. And Epictetus was a former slave as well, obviously. And the Cynics as well lived like beggars, basically. So the idea that it's just a philosophy for the Roman elite is just contrary to the historical facts, basically. The Roman elite liked it, but it was also embraced by, poorer people and the slave class even.
Speaking about the higher class people, what do you think Marcus would say about not getting seduced by fame?
Oh, he says a lot about that. I mean, I think it was his fear. Gosh, there's a really interesting story there, Chris, but I'll just be able to kind of touch on it briefly here. When I read, there are many biographies of Marcus Aurelius, and I think generally they don't pay enough attention to Hadrian. I talk a lot more about Hadrian in the biography that I've written about Marcus. And I think one reason for that is that Hadrian was seduced by fame. He was absolutely preoccupied with his kind of wanting to be revered as an intellectual, actually, and as a poet. And he kind of went crazy towards the end, became a tyrant. And I think Marcus really was frightened at first of becoming adopted into the imperial family and one day becoming emperor, because he thought, I don't want to end up like Hadrian. On the one side, he's it's all sycophants that are sucking up to him and telling him whatever. On the other hand, it's all just people plotting to assassinate him. And he's kind of caught in the middle of this, kind of gradually going bonkers. like cooped up in this massive, opulent, like luxury palace that he's created for himself, surrounded by slaves and stuff. And Marcus thought, this is just gross. Like, yeah, it's a car crash, and I don't want anything to do with it. And then, luckily for him, he was too young to become emperor. So Hadrian adopted a kind of interim ruler, Antoninus Pius, who actually ruled for 23 years, like probably longer than most people expected, because he lived a long time. He died in his 70s, I think. And Marcus had this really long apprenticeship, 23-year apprenticeship under Antoninus Pius. And I think he had this big revelation. He was the opposite of Hadrian in every regard, basically. And Antoninus thought, this guy isn't corrupted by power. The first thing he did was he moved into a somewhat more modest palace, a building, compared to this crazy, massive thing that Hadrian had constructed. And he got rid of a lot of the furnishings and statues. He went around dressed in a senatorial robes, which would be like, instead of wearing like purple, like kind of regalia like a monarch, Antoninus Pius basically wore the modern equivalent of a business suit. Like, and he adopted a kind of more presidential role as the emperor. And Marcus saw this and thought, wow, this couldn't be more different from Hadrian. And I think that inspired him to think maybe there's a way. But I think his challenge, you've read the Meditations. In book 1, he talks about 17 different people. They're all family members or tutors that he's trying to role model. He's listing their virtues. And Antoninus Pius, he says far more about than about anyone else. I think Marcus, and this is decades after Antoninus died, Marcus was obsessed with modeling his adoptive father, partly because he lost his birth father when he was very young. So he was kind of craving a father figure. And in between, he'd seen these terrible negative role models. And so he latched onto Antoninus as his savior in a way. He thought, this is a guy that I actually respect. And he provides the template for how to not turn into Hadrian, and how to be a ruler. And I think Marcus thought, how can I become like Antoninus and avoid turning into Hadrian? And the answer to that question is Stoicism. He thought, I'm going to train in Stoicism, and that way that'll help me to become more like Antoninus and less like Hadrian.
Donald Robertson, ladies and gentlemen, if people want to keep up to date with the courses you do and get the new graphic novel and stuff, where should they go?
My website's just donaldrobertson.name, N-A-M-E, so if they want to check that out, I've got stuff all over social media and things that they can have a look at.
Fantastic. Donald, I always love speaking to you. Next book, next year, as soon as it's ready, let me know. I want to bring you back on.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure as always.
What's happening, people? Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.